From the 1940s until the late 1980s, Pacific Southwest Airlines was more than just an airline. Based in San Diego, PSA became a symbol of California aviation. Its aircraft, painted in warm sunset colors and decorated with smiling faces on the nose, were a familiar and comforting sight along the West Coast. The airline's relaxed culture and efficient short-haul model later inspired what we now know as Southwest Airlines. But in September 1978, PSA was standing at the edge of a new and uncertain era. Airline deregulation was just around the corner, and while no one yet understood the long-term consequences, change was clearly coming. On the morning of 25th September, a PSA crew arrived at Sacramento Airport to operate a routine flight south. The aircraft was a Boeing 727, about 10 years old, well-maintained and trusted by the airline. The crew in charge was highly experienced. The captain had spent 17 years with PSA and logged more than 14,000 flight hours. The first officer and flight engineer also each had around a decade of service and thousands of hours on the same aircraft type. This was not an inexperienced crew. In fact, they represented the kind of professionalism PSA was known for. As passengers boarded, the pilots reviewed their paperwork. Everything looked normal. The weather was perfect, with clear skies across Southern California. It was the kind of day pilots love, smooth, bright, and predictable. The flight departed Sacramento without incident and arrived in Los Angeles shortly after 8 a.m. Some passengers left the aircraft, others boarded, including many PSA employees traveling together. With 135 people now on board, the aircraft pushed back once again. At 8:34 a.m., the Boeing 727 lifted off from Los Angeles, beginning what was expected to be a short and uneventful hop to San Diego. No one on board had any reason to believe this routine flight was about to become aviation history. The distance between Los Angeles and San Diego is barely 100 nautical miles, so even with busy airspace, the flight was expected to last little more than 30 minutes. In 1978, however, Southern California air traffic control was very different from what it is today. At that time, the airspace around San Diego was managed by a facility located at Miramar Naval Air Station. Controllers there operated a newly introduced terminal radar service area known as a TRSA, centered around Lindbergh Field. This airspace extended from 4,000 to 8,000 feet and provided radar services to airline traffic and participating visual flight aircraft. Below this TRSA, individual airports controlled their own airspace. The problem was that the boundaries between these control zones were poorly defined. Lindbergh Field's airspace overlapped with that of Montgomery Field, a small general aviation airport located just a few miles to the north. Communication and coordination between these facilities were inconsistent, and handoff procedures were still evolving. At 8:56 a.m., PSA Flight 182 was descending through 7,000 feet inside the San Diego TRSA. The first officer was flying the aircraft, while the captain monitored the flight. The flight engineer was busy coordinating arrival details with company operations. An off-duty PSA pilot was also riding in the jump seat, chatting casually with the captain. At the time, cockpit discipline rules were more relaxed than today. Conversations unrelated to flight operations were common, even during descent. The sterile cockpit concept did not yet exist. 1 minute later, the first officer reported that he had the airport in sight. This allowed air traffic control to clear the flight for a visual approach to runway 27 at Lindbergh Field. With unlimited visibility and calm conditions, this seemed like a simple and familiar procedure. The crew began preparing for a standard traffic pattern arrival, expecting a smooth and routine landing. None of them knew that another aircraft, flying just ahead and below, was already creating a dangerous situation, one that radar systems and procedures were failing to fully prevent. As Flight 182 continued toward San Diego, the crew expected to fly a standard visual traffic pattern. Coming from the northwest, they would turn left onto a downwind leg, fly parallel to the runway, then turn back toward the airport for landing. It was a procedure they had performed countless times before. At 8:59 a.m., the calm cockpit atmosphere changed slightly. San Diego approach contacted the crew with a traffic advisory. The controller reported an aircraft at their 12 o'clock position, moving northbound. Moments later, he added more detail. A small Cessna aircraft, climbing visually from about 1,400 feet, several miles ahead. Traffic advisories were common in busy terminal airspace, especially in Southern California. They were meant to increase awareness, not necessarily to signal immediate danger. The crew acknowledged the call and began looking outside for the reported traffic. A few seconds later, the first officer spotted an aircraft ahead and said so out loud. To be safe, the controller repeated the advisory, noting the Cessna was still ahead and climbing. Shortly after, the first officer confirmed that he had the traffic in sight, and the captain backed him up. With that confirmation, Air Traffic Control instructed Flight 182 to maintain visual separation from the Cessna and switch over to Lindbergh Tower for landing clearance. This decision shifted responsibility for avoiding the smaller aircraft from the controller to the pilots of the Boeing 727. At the same time, the Cessna pilot was told that a large jet was behind him and that the jet's crew had him in sight. The two aircraft were now being handled by different controllers, despite flying in the same congested airspace. From this moment on, the safety of both aircraft depended almost entirely on visual awareness, an approach that would soon prove dangerously unreliable. The small aircraft involved in the traffic advisory was a Cessna 172 operated by a local flight school based at Montgomery Field. On board were two pilots, a student working toward his instrument rating and an experienced instructor supervising the flight. The student pilot was wearing a training hood, which blocked his view outside the cockpit and forced him to rely only on the aircraft's instruments. The instructor, responsible for maintaining visual awareness, was the only one able to watch for other traffic. Earlier that morning, the Cessna had been practicing touch-and-go landings at Lindbergh Field, something that would be unthinkable at that airport today. After completing their training, they broke off and began climbing northeast toward Montgomery Field. At 8:59 a.m., the Cessna contacted San Diego approach and reported climbing through 1,500 feet. The controller acknowledged radar contact and instructed the aircraft to remain below 3,500 feet and maintain a heading of 070 degrees. This instruction created a subtle but serious issue. The Cessna was now under the control of approach, even though it was flying below the airspace where approach control normally operated. Meanwhile, PSA Flight 182 was descending into the same general area from above. The approach controller, seeing both aircraft on radar, issued a traffic advisory to the Boeing 727. At first, everything appeared under control. The jet crew believed they could see the Cessna, and the controller believed visual separation had been established. But unknown to everyone else, the Cessna soon made an unauthorized turn to the right, changing its heading without informing air traffic control. This single action quietly transformed a manageable situation into a deadly one. After being cleared for a visual approach, Flight 182 began descending and turning left onto the downwind leg. The aircraft was slowing and being configured for landing, with flaps gradually extended as the crew prepared for the final approach into San Diego. During this phase, visual awareness was critical. The first officer, who was flying the aircraft, had also been the one to report the Cessna in sight earlier. Now, however, his attention was divided between flying, communicating on the radio, and visually lining up the approach. Inside the cockpit, the flight engineer was still finishing coordination tasks with company operations and was late starting his landing checklist duties. The jump seat pilot remained engaged in conversation. No one was fully dedicated to scanning for the small aircraft below. At the same time, the Cessna's unauthorized turn placed it directly on the same flight path as the Boeing 727, moving east at a much slower speed. From the jet crew's perspective, this made the Cessna extremely difficult to detect. Because both aircraft were now traveling in nearly the same direction, the smaller plane appeared almost motionless against the city below. Compounding the problem, the traffic advisories given earlier did not include updated heading information. The jet crew had no reason to suspect the Cessna was now directly ahead and below them. By the time Lindbergh Tower issued another warning, calling out traffic 1 mile ahead, the pilots of Flight 182 were already struggling to locate the aircraft. In those critical seconds, visual separation had quietly broken down, even though everyone believed it was still in effect. As the Boeing 727 continued on the downwind leg, uncertainty began creeping into the cockpit. The crew knew another aircraft was nearby, but no one could say exactly where it was anymore. The captain questioned whether the Cessna had already passed them. The first officer admitted that he could no longer see it. When this information was relayed to the tower, the wording was unclear. What the crew meant as "it was past us" sounded to the controller like "it is passing us." This single misunderstanding changed everything. Believing the jet crew still had the Cessna in sight, the tower controller assumed visual separation was being maintained. Without altitude readouts on the tower radar, he had no clear way to verify the distance between the two aircraft. Inside the cockpit, confusion continued. The pilots searched the sky, trying to match what they thought they had seen earlier with what was happening now. Comments suggested they believed the Cessna was behind or off to the side, even though it was actually still directly ahead and below. Meanwhile, at the approach control facility, a conflict alert sounded. The radar system predicted that the two aircraft were on a collision course and would pass dangerously close within seconds. But the controller, accustomed to frequent nuisance alerts and reassured by earlier reports of visual contact, took no action. He assumed the pilots were handling it. At this moment, multiple safety layers had failed: communication, procedures, and technology, all while the aircraft continued to converge unseen. Inside the approach control room, the conflict alert continued to warn of a serious problem. The radar showed two targets closing in, both at similar altitudes and on converging paths. Standard procedures required the controller to act, but hesitation and routine worked against him. Only a month earlier, the alert system had been installed. Since then, it had triggered many times each day, often for situations that resolved on their own. Controllers had grown used to ignoring it, especially when pilots had already reported traffic in sight. The controller believed this was another one of those cases. Because Flight 182 had been cleared for visual separation and was no longer on his frequency, he assumed the crew still had the Cessna in view. He did not contact the tower, nor did he issue an avoidance instruction to the Cessna, even though he still had radio contact with it. On board the Boeing 727, the crew lowered the landing gear and continued searching outside. Seconds passed, and the uncertainty only grew. No one could positively identify the small aircraft anymore. Then, without warning, the Cessna suddenly appeared. It rose into view from below the cockpit windows, directly ahead and slightly to the right. The captain shouted in alarm. The first officer reacted instinctively, but there was no time or space to maneuver. At 9:01 and 47 seconds, the right wing of the Boeing 727 struck the Cessna from behind. The smaller aircraft was destroyed instantly, and debris tore through the jet's wing, ripping away critical structure and igniting a fire. In a single moment, the last chance to prevent disaster was gone. The impact caused catastrophic damage to the Boeing 727. A large section of the right wing's leading edge was torn away, and parts of the smaller aircraft became lodged inside the wing structure. Fuel ignited almost immediately, sending flames trailing behind the jet as it continued forward. Inside the cockpit, the crew struggled to understand what had just happened. The first officer fought the controls, applying full opposite aileron in an attempt to counter the rapidly increasing right roll. The captain tried to assess the situation, urging calm while realizing the aircraft had been critically compromised. The right wing was no longer producing enough lift, while the left wing continued to function normally. This imbalance forced the aircraft into a steep and uncontrollable right bank. As speed increased, the nose dropped, and the jet entered a tightening spiral toward the ground. The captain transmitted a final distress call to the control tower, informing them the aircraft was going down. Emergency services were alerted immediately, but there was nothing anyone could do in time. On the ground, residents across San Diego heard the Midair collision and looked up to see a burning aircraft spiraling out of the sky. Seconds later, the Boeing 727 slammed into a residential neighborhood, triggering a massive explosion. The crash destroyed homes, scattered wreckage across multiple city blocks, and ignited fires throughout the area. All 135 people on board the jet lost their lives, along with both pilots in the Cessna. Several people on the ground were also killed, turning a clear morning into a scene of devastation. The aftermath of the crash left the city of San Diego in shock. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, but the scale of destruction was overwhelming. Entire homes were destroyed, and fires burned for hours. It was the deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history at that time. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began the difficult task of determining how two aircraft could collide in clear daylight with radar coverage in place. Very quickly, attention focused on the use of visual separation and the breakdown of communication between pilots and air traffic controllers. The initial investigation concluded that the crew of Flight 182 failed to clearly inform controllers that they had lost sight of the Cessna after accepting visual separation. Air traffic control procedures were listed only as contributing factors. However, not everyone agreed. One member of the NTSB formally dissented, arguing that the core problem was the system itself. Controllers had allowed a less reliable method of separation even though radar-based separation was available. In his view, this failure should have been named the primary cause of the accident. Pilot unions also challenged the findings, stating that visual separation placed unrealistic responsibility on airline crews operating large, fast aircraft in congested airspace. As a result of these concerns, the NTSB later amended its report. Air traffic control procedures were elevated in importance, recognizing that outdated rules and poor use of technology had played a central role in the tragedy. The crash forced the aviation world to confront a hard truth: clear skies do not guarantee safety. The legacy of PSA Flight 182 changed aviation forever. The accident showed the dangers of relying only on visual separation, especially in busy airspace. It also revealed weaknesses in air traffic control procedures and technology usage. In response, the Federal Aviation Administration and the NTSB pushed for innovations to prevent similar disasters. This led to the creation of the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, or TCAS. Today, it is standard on commercial aircraft and provides automated alerts and guidance when other planes get dangerously close. Procedures were also updated so that visual separation is only used if pilots specifically request it, rather than by default. The lessons of Flight 182 continue to resonate. Pilots, air traffic controllers, and safety regulators still study the accident. It helps them understand how human factors, miscommunication, and system limitations can combine to create catastrophic situations. The crash claimed 144 lives, including passengers, crew, and people on the ground. But it forced the aviation industry to improve, making air travel safer for millions. Flight 182 is a sobering reminder that even routine flights carry risks. Constant vigilance and innovation are essential to prevent tragedy. On a lighter note, as this story concludes, I will celebrate personally because today is also my birthday. Safety and cake, two things we should never take for granted. Imagine an accident where nearly every safety net aviation relies on is torn apart: training, communication, discipline, and basic judgment. This story is exactly that. It is the chilling account of how Aeroflot Nord Flight 821 moved step by step toward disaster, not because of a single failure, but because almost everything failed at once. To understand how this could happen, we must first look at the airline and the pilots long before the night of the crash. The airline involved did not begin as Aeroflot Nord. It was founded in 1963 in the Soviet Union as a small regional operator flying only domestically. For decades, it operated classic Soviet-built aircraft and followed a flying culture built around 3 or 4-person cockpits, where duties were spread between pilots, navigators, and flight engineers. In 2004, the Russian flag carrier Aeroflot purchased a controlling share of the airline and renamed it Aeroflot Nord. This marked the start of rapid expansion. Management wanted modern aircraft that were cheaper to operate and suitable for regional routes. Their choice was the Boeing 737-500. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it introduced risks the airline was not prepared to manage. Before the 737 arrived, Aeroflot Nord pilots had only flown Soviet aircraft like the Tu-154, Tu-134, and Antonov types. These airplanes were designed around a very different philosophy. The Boeing 737, with its two-pilot cockpit, heavy automation, and English-only documentation, required a complete shift in mindset, crew coordination, and system knowledge. Despite this, little attention was paid to how pilots would adapt to Western procedures, automation logic, or crew resource management. Manuals were in English, a language many pilots barely understood. Training programs existed on paper, but how carefully they were followed was another matter entirely. This was the environment in which the crew of Flight 821 was created. And on one dark September night in 2008, all of these weaknesses would come together with catastrophic results. The captain of Flight 821 was 35 years old and, despite holding the left seat, was still relatively inexperienced. His total flight time was around 3,900 hours, most of it accumulated on older Soviet aircraft. Until recently, he had only flown as a first officer. His upgrade to captain came after just over 700 hours on the Boeing 737, a type that was completely new to him in both technology and philosophy. His initial 737 training had been completed in the United States, but crucial records from that course were missing. As a result, investigators could never confirm how well he actually performed. What was documented, however, were irregularities in his line training and checking afterward. The airline appeared to sign off qualifications without strictly following its own approved training program. Fatigue was another concern. Although the captain had technically rested enough before Flight 821, he had flown several demanding night flights in the days prior. On at least one occasion, he received only half the legally required rest. This raised serious questions about cumulative fatigue affecting his performance. His English proficiency was rated very low, roughly equivalent to ICAO Level 2. This was below international standards, but still better than that of his colleague. The first officer was 43 years old and actually had more total flight time, nearly 8,900 hours. However, most of that experience came from flying a single-engine Antonov biplane and later Soviet jet aircraft. On the Boeing 737, he had logged only 236 hours. During his type rating, instructors noted repeated difficulties. He struggled with English, with understanding procedures, and with handling asymmetric thrust situations. This was critical, because the 737's engines are mounted far from the centerline, making thrust imbalance far more demanding to control than on older Soviet designs. There was also no formal upset, prevention or recovery training in the airline's syllabus. These two pilots were flying a modern jet with limited preparation, weak communication skills, and little shared understanding of how to work as a team. All of this set the stage for what was about to unfold. The aircraft assigned to Flight 821 was a Boeing 737-500 registered in Bermuda, a detail that would later allow investigators to publish the final report in English. By the time of the accident, the airplane had logged more than 44,000 flight hours and had previously operated with an airline in China. This particular 737 had several unusual characteristics. One of the most important involved its flight director. Unlike most aircraft in the fleet, it used an older V-bar style display instead of standard command bars. This system presented guidance in a way that could be visually confusing, especially for pilots transitioning from Soviet-era attitude indicators, where the horizon remains fixed and the aircraft symbol moves. In stressful situations, this difference could easily lead to incorrect control inputs. The aircraft also had a long-standing issue with its thrust levers. In the mid-range, the right engine produced more thrust than the left, even when both levers were aligned. At high or idle thrust, the problem disappeared, pointing to a trimming or sensor fault. To compensate, The autothrottle often staggered the levers to keep engine output equal. Several days before the accident, this imbalance caused the autothrottle to disconnect multiple times. Instead of troubleshooting the root cause, maintenance simply labeled the autothrottle as inoperative. Proper deactivation procedures were never completed, no circuit breakers pulled, no clear markings placed. As a result, flight crews continued using the system as if it were normal. This meant the aircraft was dispatched with a known, unresolved thrust asymmetry and an automation system that could disconnect unexpectedly. Combined with pilots already struggling with automation and manual thrust handling, this created a dangerous situation waiting for the right trigger. On the night of 13 September 2008, that trigger was about to arrive. In the early hours of 13 September 2008, the crew of Flight 821 arrived at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport shortly after midnight. The first officer arrived first with most of the cabin crew. The captain followed a little later. All crew members passed the mandatory medical checks and then gathered to review the flight paperwork. The flight was a routine passenger service to Perm with 82 passengers on board. Weather at the destination showed rain and mist, but nothing outside normal limits. There were no obvious red flags that would delay the flight. At the aircraft, the captain reviewed the technical log. He noted that the autothrottle was marked inoperative, but since it had not been physically disabled and no engineers were present, he likely assumed it could still be used. Another deferred item was the TCAS system, which was allowed under regulations and caused no concern. The first officer began setting up the cockpit. During this process, the inertial reference system had to be aligned. This system was already vulnerable because the aircraft had no GPS to correct navigation drift in flight. To make matters worse, the initial position was entered incorrectly, creating a navigation error from the very start. Although such an error should have been manageable by cross-checking raw navigation data, it added another hidden weakness. After the exterior inspection, the captain made a welcome announcement to the passengers. Pushback was requested, and just after 3:06 local time, the aircraft began taxiing for departure. Unnoticed by the passengers, several safety layers had already been compromised before the aircraft even reached the runway. As the aircraft taxied toward runway 7 liters, there were no cockpit voice recordings available from this phase, so investigators could only reconstruct events from data. What is clear, however, is that standard procedures were already being ignored. The first officer was designated as pilot flying. According to procedure, the aircraft should have been lined up first, then thrust slowly increased to allow the engines to stabilize before selecting takeoff power. This step is especially important on aircraft prone to asymmetric thrust. Instead, during the line-up turn, the captain advanced the thrust levers significantly. Because of the known thrust imbalance, the right engine produced far more power than the left. The aircraft immediately began to yaw, forcing the first officer to apply large rudder inputs just to stay on the center line. This unexpected workload meant the takeoff buttons were never pressed at the correct time. As a result, proper takeoff thrust was not set, and acceleration was slower than normal. The autothrottle later entered a hold mode, preventing it from correcting the error. Only after rotation did the thrust finally reach the correct level. By then, the aircraft was already airborne with multiple procedural violations behind it. This chaotic takeoff revealed a lack of understanding of both aircraft systems and basic crew coordination. It was an early warning sign but one that went unnoticed by the crew. The flight climbed away into the night, carrying its unresolved problems with it. After departure, the aircraft climbed normally toward its cruise altitude. Autopilot B was engaged, and for a time the flight appeared stable. However, beneath the surface, a critical navigation problem was quietly growing. Because the aircraft had no GPS, its inertial reference system depended on radio updates to remain accurate. On this route, suitable stations were sparse. Combined with the incorrectly entered starting position, the system began drifting steadily. With every passing hour, the aircraft's displayed position moved farther from reality. At cruise level, the autothrottle remained engaged and continued compensating for the thrust imbalance by keeping the levers uneven. Since engine power appeared equal on the instruments, the crew noticed nothing unusual. As the aircraft neared Perm, the pilots began discussing the arrival. The first officer attempted to load the procedure into the flight management computer but struggled with manual waypoint entry. This took far longer than expected and absorbed most of his attention. As a result, two critical tasks were skipped: the descent checklist and the approach briefing. These are not formalities. They ensure both pilots share the same plan, understand threats, and verify configurations. Without them, coordination begins to break down. When descent clearance was issued, altitudes were set without proper callouts or crosschecks. Mode changes went largely unannounced. Communication inside the cockpit became fragmented, and responsibility between pilot flying and pilot monitoring blurred. This erosion of discipline meant that when things started going wrong later, there would be no shared mental picture to fall back on, only confusion. As the aircraft descended, confusion inside the cockpit continued to grow. The crew discussed weather, radio frequencies, and arrival routes, but rarely confirmed anything clearly. Even basic duties became mixed. At times, the captain handled radios while also making control inputs, while the first officer tried to fly and monitor at the same time. This broke a core rule of two-pilot operations: clear division of responsibility. When the approach controller issued a revised arrival route, the first officer read back the wrong one. Although corrected, this change unsettled him. The new routing required more maneuvering and better situational awareness, yet no rebrief was done. Neither pilot clearly stated which runway they expected to land on, and assumptions quietly replaced confirmations. Meanwhile, the navigation display error had grown to several kilometers. The aircraft was no longer flying where the crew believed it was. This should have been caught by cross-checking raw navigation instruments, but those checks were never done. During descent, the autothrottle began increasing thrust to maintain speed. Because of the known engine imbalance, asymmetric thrust returned. The autopilot compensated automatically, masking the problem. The pilots remained focused on discussions rather than monitoring aircraft behavior. Sterile cockpit rules were ignored. Non-essential conversations continued, including criticism of others and unrelated remarks. At one point, a cabin crew member entered to remind them about the seatbelt sign, something the pilots had forgotten. Instead of correcting the oversight, the captain dismissed the concern. By now, stress levels were rising, clarity was fading, and the aircraft was being guided more by automation than by understanding. The approach phase was approaching fast, but the foundation for a safe landing had already collapsed. As Flight 821 neared the airport, the confusion reached a critical point. The crew was still uncertain about which runway they were cleared to land on. The first officer repeatedly believed they were setting up for runway 03, while the captain assumed it would be runway 21. Strangely, neither pilot directly asked air traffic control for confirmation. The aircraft descended through 10,000 feet without a pressurization check. Altimeter settings were discussed but not properly cross-checked. When QFE was finally mentioned, it was only set on one altimeter, leaving the other incorrect. The approach checklist designed to catch exactly these errors was never completed. Due to navigation system drift, the aircraft's position on the display was now several kilometers off. This made the crew believe they were closer and better positioned than they actually were. In reality, they were high, fast, and poorly aligned for any approach. When cleared to descend further and turn, the crew selected modes that increased workload instead of reducing it. Manual thrust was now required, but thrust was not managed smoothly. Speed increased, then decreased, confusing the first officer, who struggled to understand why the aircraft was not descending as expected. The controller, seeing the aircraft still far too high, questioned whether they were actually descending. This triggered visible frustration from the captain. His voice grew sharper, and his instructions became less clear. Despite being well above profile, the captain pushed to continue the approach instead of stabilizing or requesting a second attempt. The aircraft was now heading toward the runway in an unstable state, setting the stage for the final loss of control. Cleared to turn inbound, the crew began configuring the aircraft aggressively to lose altitude. The landing gear was extended early, followed by flaps. Drag increased sharply, but thrust management became erratic. The aircraft was still far too high, yet now slowing rapidly. With flaps at 30 and gear down, the autopilot remained engaged. As speed decayed, the first officer added thrust, but because the engines were not trimmed equally, asymmetric thrust returned immediately. The autopilot tried to compensate by applying increasing aileron. At low speed, it quickly reached its limits. The aircraft began a slow, unnoticed roll to the left. The first officer was fixated on speed control. The captain was distracted by radio calls and did not monitor the attitude. By the time the bank angle became obvious, it was already severe. Sudden control inputs followed. Automation modes changed unintentionally. The aircraft pitched up, climbed, then slowed again. Thrust was added, then reduced. Each correction created a new problem. The situation spiraled faster than either pilot could process. At one point, the captain told the first officer to do everything yourself, abandoning leadership in the most critical phase. Moments later, both pilots were overwhelmed. Control inputs conflicted. Banked angels exceeded warnings. When the first officer finally asked the captain to take control, the response was hesitation, followed by abrupt, incorrect inputs. The aircraft rolled steeply. Recovery became impossible. In seconds, the Boeing 737 entered an extreme attitude, still fully configured for landing. There was no altitude left, no margin, and no clear understanding of what was happening. The final outcome was now unavoidable. In its final seconds, the aircraft rolled almost completely inverted and pitched sharply nose down. At high speed and low altitude, recovery was impossible. Flight 821 struck the ground near the Trans-Siberian Railway line, killing all 88 people on board instantly. No one on the ground was injured, but the wreckage told a brutal story of total loss of control. When investigators analyzed the flight recorders, they uncovered a cockpit defined by confusion, stress, and the near-total absence of crew coordination. Procedures were ignored, automation was misunderstood, and basic monitoring collapsed. The pilots never regained situational awareness once it was lost. The most disturbing discovery came later. A passenger had sent a text message before departure, saying the captain sounded drunk during the welcome announcement. Initial tests found no alcohol, but advanced analysis later confirmed alcohol in the captain's system at the time of the crash. Combined with fatigue, this explained his slurred speech, poor judgment, and emotional instability. The investigation did not stop with the crew. Authorities criticized the airline, maintenance organization, regulators, and air traffic control. Training standards were weak, English proficiency checks were inadequate, and known technical problems were ignored. More than 40 safety recommendations followed, including stricter training, better oversight, proper CRM enforcement, and mandatory upset recovery instruction. Flight 821 was not caused by fate or weather. It was caused by a broken system, one failure stacked upon another until nothing was left to stop the fall. September 2006. High above Europe, something was about to go terribly wrong. On the morning of 15th September 2006, an EasyJet Airbus A319 was preparing to leave Alicante, Spain, bound for Bristol, United Kingdom. On board were 138 passengers and 6 crew members, most of them British tourists returning home after a short holiday in the Spanish sun. The flight was expected to last just 2.5 hours. Nothing unusual. But hidden beneath the calm routine was a serious risk no one truly understood yet. The aircraft was brand new, recently delivered from Airbus. EasyJet was in the middle of modernizing its fleet, slowly replacing older Boeing 737s with newer, more fuel-efficient Airbus jets. For the airline, this was progress. For the pilots, it was still unfamiliar territory. The captain, aged 42, had nearly 9,000 flight hours, but fewer than 400 hours on Airbus aircraft. The first officer had just over 3,000 total hours, with around 500 hours on Airbus jets. Both pilots were experienced, but still adjusting to the aircraft's complex systems. Before departure, the crew was informed of a technical issue. One of the aircraft's electrical generators, powered by the left engine, was not working correctly and had been shut down. The problem was considered manageable. The aircraft still had another generator, plus the APU, a small engine in the tail that could supply electricity. As a precaution, the APU would remain running for the entire flight. At 11:10 a.m., boarding was complete. Fuel was loaded. Doors were closed. Flight EasyJet 6074 pushed back from the gate. No one on board knew that this routine departure would soon turn into one of the most unsettling incidents in modern aviation. At 11:25 a.m., the captain lined up the Airbus A319 on runway 28 at Alicante Airport. The engines spooled up smoothly, and the aircraft surged forward. Takeoff was normal. The jet lifted cleanly into the air and turned north, climbing steadily toward its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet. From the cabin, everything felt routine. Seatbelt signs switched off. Flight attendants began moving through the aisle, serving drinks and meals. Passengers relaxed, unaware that anything was wrong. In the cockpit, the pilots monitored the aircraft's systems. Despite the known generator issue, all indications appeared stable. With the APU running and the right side generator active, there was no reason for concern. As the aircraft crossed into French airspace, the skies were calm. The busy summer travel season was ending, and traffic was lighter than usual. For nearly 90 minutes, the flight progressed without incident. Then, without warning, everything changed. A loud mechanical clunk echoed through the cockpit. In an instant, the captain's primary screens went completely black. Warning tones blared. The autopilot disconnected. Reacting immediately, the captain handed control to the first officer, whose displays were still functioning. Now flying manually, the first officer gripped the side stick tightly as the aircraft continued through the sky at nearly the speed of sound. The captain looked around in disbelief. Multiple systems had failed at once. This was not a single warning, it was a cascading shutdown. And this was only the beginning. With the first officer focused on keeping the aircraft stable, the captain tried to understand what had failed. His main flight displays were dead. Even more worrying, the radio panel was completely dark. No lights. No frequencies. No response. Without radios, the crew had no way to talk to air traffic control. The captain assumed the issue might be linked to the APU, which had been running since departure. If the APU generator had failed, it could explain the sudden loss of power. He quickly turned to the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, one of the few screens still alive. The ECAM checklist guided him step by step through the emergency. One instruction stood out. If successful, it could restore electrical power instantly. The checklist called for switching the AC electrical feed to an alternate source. But there was a problem. The checklist stated that a fault light should be illuminated on the switch before selecting it. The light was off. The captain hesitated. Was there no fault? Or was the light itself powerless? With most of the cockpit already dark, he realized the switch light might simply have no electricity. He pressed the button. Nothing happened. No lights returned. No systems recovered. Worse still, the design of the switch gave no physical indication of its position. Without power, the pilots couldn't tell if it was engaged or not. Now the situation was clear. They were flying at 32,000 feet, with severely degraded systems, no autopilot, and no confirmed way to communicate with the outside world. And far below them, controllers were starting to notice something was very wrong. The captain now had one urgent priority: communication. Even though the radio panel was dark, he hoped the radios themselves might still work. He keyed the microphone and called Brest Air Traffic Control on VHF-1. No reply. He switched to VHF-2 and tried again. Silence. Growing more anxious, the captain tuned the radio to 121.5 MHz, the international emergency frequency, and declared a mayday. He repeated the call on both radios. Still nothing. The first officer then attempted to transmit using his own controls. Again, no response. Flight EasyJet 6074 was now completely cut off from the outside world. Inside the cabin, the situation seemed normal. The aircraft was flying smoothly, with no sudden movements or alarms. But a few subtle signs hinted at trouble. On the left side of the cabin, the reading lights and no smoking signs went dark. It was daytime, so most passengers likely didn't notice. But this confirmed what the pilots feared: the electrical failure was spreading beyond the cockpit. Meanwhile, far below in France, an air traffic controller noticed something alarming. The EasyJet aircraft had vanished from radar. No transponder signal. No radio contact. The controller immediately tried calling the flight. There was no answer. As seconds passed, concern turned into fear. A passenger jet had gone silent in midair, and no one knew why. The controller at Briest Area Control tried repeatedly to reach EasyJet 6074. There was no response. Without radar contact and without radio communication, the situation was critical. Several terrifying possibilities crossed his mind: a catastrophic failure, a bomb, or even a hijacking. But there was a more immediate danger. To the north of EasyJet 6074, an American Airlines jet was cruising at the same altitude, 32,000 feet. Their flight paths were about to cross. If the EasyJet aircraft was still flying straight ahead, the two jets were less than a minute from collision. The controller acted fast. He contacted the American Airlines flight and asked the crew to check their TCAS, the onboard collision avoidance system. The pilots scanned their displays. Nothing. Unknown to them, EasyJet 6074's TCAS had lost power during the electrical failure. This meant only one aircraft could see the threat, and it wasn't the one in danger. Seconds felt like hours. With no confirmation of EasyJet's position, the controller made a split-second decision. He ordered the American Airlines jet to descend to 31,000 feet. As the aircraft began its descent, the pilots suddenly saw something out the window. An EasyJet aircraft passed just overhead. The two planes had missed each other by only 19 seconds. In the control room, the tension broke. A disaster had been narrowly avoided. But the mystery remained. Why was the EasyJet plane still silent? Back in the cockpit, the pilots had no idea how close they had come to disaster. They were still trying to solve the communication failure, unaware of the near midair collision behind them. The captain returned to the ECAM checklist, following each step carefully. One instruction stood out: switch to transponder 2. The transponder was the aircraft's digital identity. Without it, air traffic control could not see the plane. The captain made the switch. Suddenly, numbers appeared on the transponder display. But there was a problem. No other lights were illuminated. Was the transponder truly working? Or were the digits visible while the system itself remained powerless? The pilots couldn't be sure. Minutes later, in the control center, the controller felt a wave of relief. EasyJet 6074 had reappeared on radar, flying smoothly at 32,000 feet. He immediately called the aircraft. Still no reply. The pilots now discussed their squawk code. 3 emergency codes existed. 7500 for hijacking, 7600 for radio failure, 7700 for general emergency. This situation was more than a simple radio problem. The captain selected 7700 and pressed ident. On the controller's screen, the message was clear. EasyJet 6074 was in serious trouble, but still completely silent. And no one knew what the crew planned to do next. After setting the emergency code, the captain tried one last standard fix. He turned generator 1 off, then back on. Nothing changed. The cockpit remained mostly dark. Critical systems were still without power. Worse yet, the design of the switches made things unclear. Without illuminated lights, the pilots couldn't be certain whether a system was actually on or off. The captain began searching for anything unusual earlier in the flight. Then it clicked. The APU had been running non-stop since takeoff. What if it was part of the problem? With no better options left, the captain shut the APU down completely, then restarted it. The crew waited. No screens returned. No radios came alive. Whatever had failed was deeper than they feared. At this point, the captain called the lead flight attendant to the cockpit. He explained that they were facing a serious emergency and that the cabin needed to be prepared for a possible emergency landing. It was the first time the cabin crew realized the gravity of the situation. As the flight attendant returned to brief the passengers, the pilots faced a critical decision. Should they divert to a closer airport? Or continue to Bristol, their original destination? Diverting might save time, but turning off course without radio contact could trigger a military interception. Flying predictably along their planned route felt safer. After a tense discussion, the captain made his choice. They would continue to Bristol. Choosing Bristol solved one problem, but created many others. The aircraft would remain airborne longer, with no guarantee that the situation wouldn't get worse. The captain worried about landing performance. Bristol Airport had one of the shortest runways among major UK airports. If systems like spoilers, flaps, or thrust reversers failed, stopping safely might be impossible. The captain opened the quick reference handbook, searching for landing distance charts. He found data for an emergency electrical configuration, not identical, but close enough. The numbers suggested that runway 09 at Bristol would be just sufficient, especially if the runway was dry. That was encouraging. The captain then programmed the arrival route into the first officer's flight computer. Using a standard arrival would make the aircraft's movements predictable to controllers. Soon after, the descent began. The first officer hand-flew the aircraft down from 32,000 feet, something pilots almost never do in normal operations. Despite the pressure, he handled it smoothly. Both pilots worked in calm coordination, sharing tasks and staying focused. But as the aircraft descended, a new concern emerged. The first officer began to feel cold and lightheaded, early signs of hypoxia. Was the cabin losing pressure? They considered using oxygen masks but chose not to. They were already descending toward breathable altitude. Time was running out. The hardest part was still ahead. As EasyJet 6074 descended toward the UK, air traffic controllers in London were watching closely. The aircraft was still silent, but it was following its planned route toward Bristol. London controllers immediately alerted Bristol Air Traffic Control. A non-communicating aircraft was inbound. Bristol declared a full emergency. Fire engines, ambulances, and rescue teams rushed into position. All other flights were halted. Back in the cockpit, the pilots faced a critical test. They needed to know if the flaps would work. Without them, landing speed would be much higher and the short runway might not be enough. At around 12:20 p.m., the captain moved the flap lever to the first setting. The seconds felt endless. Then confirmation. The instruments showed the flaps extending. Relief flooded the cockpit. With flaps available, a normal landing speed was possible. Next came the biggest question of all. The landing gear. The captain lowered the gear lever. Nothing happened. No sound. No green lights. If the gear didn't deploy, the aircraft would have to land on its engines, risking fire and destruction. But there was still one last option. The pilots moved fast. The Airbus A319 was equipped with a manual gravity gear extension system. If electrical systems failed, the landing gear could still drop using gravity alone. The captain pulled the handle and began cranking. Slowly, the gear doors unlocked. One by one, the wheels fell into place. This time, the pilots didn't rely on lights. They felt the aircraft's drag increase, a sign the gear was down. The aircraft was now configured for landing. In a final attempt to reach the ground, the captain pulled out his mobile phone and tried calling Bristol Air Traffic Control. No signal. The first officer tried his phone. Nothing. There would be no landing clearance. As the runway came into view, the automated voice counted down. 100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Touchdown. The first officer applied maximum braking. The engines roared into full reverse thrust. The aircraft slowed rapidly. Against all odds, EasyJet 6074 came to a safe stop on the runway. All 144 people on board survived. Later investigation revealed the cause: a faulty electrical contact inside a transformer had falsely detected current, shutting down the main electrical bus. Airbus would later redesign its systems, adding automatic power transfers, improved radio redundancy, and better cockpit switch indications. But on that day, it wasn't technology that saved the flight. It was calm decision-making, teamwork, and skill. Flight 6074 had gone silent. But it made it home.